Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson and American history. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And once again, we have a very special guest. Clay, would you care to introduce him, sir?
Joseph Ellis is with us today from his undisclosed location in the Green Mountains of Vermont. It's the 6th day of November 2020, and we wanted to ask ourselves what just happened. Joe Ellis is the author of more than a dozen books. He's won the Pulitzer Prize, and he's won the National Book Award, among others. Now, here's where things stand, Joe. It appears on the 6th of November that Joe Biden will win the presidency narrowly, but clearly. At the moment, he's ahead in Georgia and likely to win there. He's ahead in Pennsylvania and likely to win there. He's already been announced the victor in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. It appears that he will win in Nevada. We're not quite certain about Arizona, but it looks as if he will hold on there. If so, he would have 306 electoral votes. Professor Ellis, is that how you see it?
It is. I think it's in some sense an electorally decisive victory, almost exactly the same electorally decisive victory as Trump achieved in 2016. On the other side, I believe when all the votes are counted, that Biden will win the popular vote by between 4 and 5 million.
So you're saying that Biden is going to win decisively in the popular vote and clearly
Yes,
in the electoral vote.
But I will qualify it. In so many of these states, the electoral margin was razor thin. I would say we have a decisive verdict on the presidential election, and we are still a divided people.
Yes, clearly. So there will be recounts in Michigan and Wisconsin and probably elsewhere. And already the Trump administration or Trump's campaign has filed lawsuits in a range of directions. So we don't know yet quite what is going to happen. And let me ask you this question. Would it surprise you terribly if Mr. Trump wound up winning even so?
Oh, yes. I think that's virtually impossible. I think that would require legal decisions which are impossible to imagine. Most of the legal charges or claims he's made are frivolous. The few that aren't would make a difference of a few thousand votes, perhaps in Pennsylvania, which would be insufficient to change the results in any state. I don't believe that legally that this is going to be changed. I do believe, however, that politically this will produce a backlash from the Trump supporters and from the people who believe the conspiracy theories that he is proposing, that this was a rigged election, and that that will play out in a way that is ugly and unpredictable.
So in 2016, President Trump candidate Trump narrowly defeated Hillary Clinton to become the 45th president of the United States. And once the election results were in, Mrs. Clinton conceded. She slipped away. She did not give incendiary interviews to the press. She did not say that the election was rigged. She did not file lawsuits in all of the states where the election count was close. Isn't that the way we expect things to occur in our republic?
Well, yes, and I can push it back as a historian further than that in the 2000 election, the Florida vote controversy was extremely controversial, and Gore accepted the verdict of the courts, even though it was a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court, wholly along partisan lines. Secondly, I would also call attention to the fact that in 1960, it seems pretty clear in retrospect that Kennedy won the election in large part because Illinois voted the graveyard several times over with Mayor Daley at the helm.
You mean there was voter fraud in Illinois?
Nixon could have easily contested that vote, and he didn't even consider doing it. He walked away because he knew that it would be too disruptive and chaotic. In the case of President Trump, I think there's no question that President Trump is not going to do that.
You're a historian. Has there been an election in American history where the loser refused to concede and suggested that he might refuse to leave?
No, nothing akin to what President Trump is attempting has ever been tried before. In so many respects, the Trump presidency is unprecedented, and in this case as well.
So just want to make that point again. We've had almost 60 presidential elections in the course of American history. This includes 1860, which led to the secession of the southern states, and 1960, where it seems clear now that Mayor Daley cheated with voter fraud in Illinois and possibly also some in Texas to make John Kennedy the winner, and Nixon said no for the good of the country. He would not contest it. We also know that in 2000, historians are divided on this question, but some believe that if the voter recount had continued in Florida, that Al Gore would have been the winner there and therefore would have been the president of the United States. And yet in none of those situations has there been a candidate who lost who either refused to accept the results or suggested that he would not peacefully leave his position as the president of the United States. That's a pretty clear record of what might be called presidential sportsmanship.
Yes, I think that's true. There have been at least 3 elections that come to mind in which the result was unclear, and it went to the House in 1800, 1824, 1876, and that a lot of parlaying went on then, and a lot of political back and forthing that had consequences. The end of Reconstruction in 1876, but the kind of example you're mentioning, in which the losing candidate refuses to acknowledge the will of the electorate, has never occurred.
Now, you would expect in a situation like this for the establishment, senior Republicans, people on the courts, the commentators, you would expect there would be a near unanimity of condemnation for that sort of misbehavior. Do you expect that to happen?
No. I think it's unclear at this stage, as we are talking on this Friday morning. Already, several Republican senators have appeared on Fox News to endorse the president's view that this is a rigged election. But I believe that we will wait and see over the next few days and even weeks. And I suspect the place to look to find out whether you can see a shift there is Fox News, because that's going to be the venue in which some Republicans step forward. I think McConnell might very well be such a creature, believe it or not, to say that the verdict of the electorate is clear and cannot be contested, and it's time to step away from that. That said, apart from the leadership in the Republican Party, the grassroots support for President Trump and the people who have most ardently voted for him are going to be, it seems to me, easily disposed to believe that this is a rigged election. And that conspiracy theory is not true. Conspiracy theories are an integral part of American history. The American Revolution is based on a conspiracy theory that the British were intending to enslave us. Not really. They just want to make us colonists. But I think that ardent group of supporters for President Trump will be active, and I worry how this is going to play out in terms of our response to the virus and to President Biden's efforts to pull us together in order to reduce the deaths on that side.
But going back to the result, so Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota go for Biden. Nevada appears to be for Biden, and even Arizona. If that were the case, he would have won by 270 electoral votes, which is the bare minimum for an electoral college victory. That would have made it easier, in my view, for the conspiracy theorists to howl. But if Biden wins Pennsylvania and Georgia, that means he won by several paths, and it would make it harder, I think, for Mr. Trump to really make the case that the election was stolen or that there were irregularities.
I agree completely. I think that the other problem that the legal team around Trump has is that in some states they want to not count votes, and in other states they want to count votes. Arizona, they want to count them. Georgia, they don't. But I think the margins in each of those states are sufficient that, based on past history, when you've had recounts, it could be 100 or 200 or 300 votes that get changed. But In Pennsylvania, it's going to be 30 to 40,000. In Georgia, it's going to be 25 to 30, and therefore there's no real room for a claim. And the judgments of federal judges, including very Republican federal judges in states like Texas, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, have consistently thrown out as bogus and totally frivolous the claims thus far. I don't think this is going to be a legal fight. I think this is going to be a political fight.
After the 2016 election, where there was widespread talk on the right of voter fraud and so on, Mr. Trump set up a commission to look into this, and he had a vicious partisan handling it. And it turns out that after a few months, they quietly disbanded because they could not find any actual evidence of more than extremely minor voter fraud all over the United States. So that argument of voter fraud comes back again and again and again, and we see calls for voter ID and so on. Do you think we need another voting rights law to clarify some of this so that this kind of nonsense doesn't repeat itself over and over again?
The short answer is no. I think that the Supreme Court did have a ruling 3 years ago that drew back some of the protections for African Americans in the states of the former Confederacy that had been put in earlier to protect their rights, saying they were no longer necessary. I think the voter turnout shows that the restrictions didn't work. I mean, I think that there were attempts to restrict voter registration in some of those states. I think the big piece of attempted voter fraud in this election was the attempt by the post office to delay mail, which is responsible for the lateness of the vote in several of the states that are going to be contested. So you corrupt the election and then charge it with corruption. That's the most glaring attempt to fix the election. But all studies of mail-in voting, and there have been many, show that it's actually less corruptible and safer than day-in voting. It's got 0.0001% of corruption. But I think this is the way of the future for voting.
Gentlemen, we need to take just a short break, but we'll return to this special post-election discussion with Professor Joseph Ellis and Clay Jenkinson in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, our special post-election discussion with Clay Jenkinson, Professor Joseph Ellis. I'm your host, David Swenson. And Joe, it's always good to talk to you and get your perspective. In the previous part of the conversation, you talked about the grassroots support for Trump. And as you well know, Clay and I live in a pretty red area of America. Mm-hmm. This morning, I listened to local talk radio, and I heard a caller suggest that Trump should declare martial law. He should get Fauci by his side and say that we had to declare martial law because of COVID, and that would keep Trump in power for 3 to 5 years. So you can see how extreme the viewpoints are of some of the red voters in our part of the world.
I'm not surprised at that, David, and I think the people saying that ardently believe what they're saying. They're wrong, but they are sincere. But the kind of solution they're proposing is dictatorship. And I think that the Jefferson Hour is hardly in a position to be an advocate of dictatorship.
Actually, the caller said he would be happy to live under an authoritarian government just to keep that, quote, crooked Biden out of office.
That's a sign of the times, I think.
I get why people feel that way, Joe. I don't understand it, but I get it. I mean, we acknowledge it. And I do think that human beings in times of great uncertainty sort of gravitate towards more authoritarian leadership. So that doesn't greatly surprise me either. But here's what does surprise me. Donald Trump. Why is he doing this? And I know that there are easy answers to that, but why is the 45th president of the United States playing so recklessly and, in my opinion, dangerously with the idea that this was a stolen election?
I've never met Donald Trump, but it seems to me clear that it is literally impossible for Donald Trump to think about this election and its results in a way that we would regard as incompatible with the integrity of previous losers.
If I were his principal aide, his advisor, and yet an ardent Trumpite and an ardent Republican and a conservative, I would nevertheless say, and I think that any advisor would say, look, Elections matter. You won by a squeaker in 2016. You appear to have lost by a little bit more definitive an election in 2020. What you're doing is very dangerous, sir, that our system depends upon a peaceful transfer of power. It depends upon an acquiescence in the will of the majority, the will of the people as it's expressed through our electoral system.
I think the kind of people around him that would be able to say that are no longer there. They've been removed long ago. And that you were asking him, I mean, in some sense, when he takes the oath as president, he says, to the best, you pledge loyalty to the Constitution, to the best of my ability. It is to the best of his ability. He doesn't have the ability to understand any source of authority outside of himself.
Does he understand that what he is suggesting is essentially a right-wing populist takeover of the Constitution of the United States? Does he understand the gravity of that?
No. He only understands it in personal terms. He believes, remember he said, just read Article 2 of the Constitution. I can do anything I want to do. No, well, I mean, I've read Article 2 of the Constitution 100 times. It doesn't say that. In fact, of course, says quite the opposite. But he believes that. And he's got people around him, like his attorney general, who somewhat reinforces that point of view. No, I don't see any hope that President Trump himself is going to have any kind of change of mind at all on this matter.
Gentlemen, this is too good of an opportunity to miss. So on behalf of our listeners, this is the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and we've got two brilliant historians to talk to. Could you share some insight on the transfer of power during Jefferson's time and how that all happened?
Yeah, let me start on that because I want to. Yesterday, Joe and I were talking privately on the telephone, and we had a great laugh together because I said, what will happen if Mr. Trump does in fact lose? And Joe, you said, well, he'll refuse to come to the inauguration. He'll have some sort of a counter event down at Mar-a-Lago on the day of January 20th, 2021. And we both laughed. And I said, well, he'd be the second person to skulk out of town.
That's right. That was Adams. Took the stage out of Washington at 4:30. The guy on the stage with him is a guy who voted against him from Massachusetts. He had to ride with him for hours. He was going to New York because his son, Charlie, was dying. He was dying of alcoholism and drug addiction, as a matter of fact. He didn't get there in time. Charlie died beforehand. So he had an ulterior motive. And later on in their lives, as you know better than or as well as I, they recovered their friendship. And it wasn't, but there was no precedent in 1800 in the same way there is now. It wasn't even clear whether when there was a change of power that the loser had to show up. And so, but the tradition since then, of course, is virtually, perfect. And so if Trump decides that he's not going to participate in the inauguration, but even more so if his staff is obliged by law to cooperate with the Biden administration for the transfer of power. Although I think that will be rough, and I don't think the Biden administration is expecting much cooperation. And during that time, I'm concerned about the time between now and January 20th. I mean, we're in a kind of interregnum period, and nobody's really in charge. It used to be that until Franklin Roosevelt, the election was early November and the inauguration was in April.
No, March, the 4th of March.
I know this is not going to happen, but I'd like to move it up to before Christmas and see if maybe we could. I mean, I would also like to go to, doing away with the Electoral College and have a popular election of the presidency. That's not going to happen in the near future either. But we're going to be in a equivocal and potentially dangerous moment for an extended period of time from early November to late January.
Joseph Ellis, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, the author of more than a dozen spectacular books on the early national period, an eminent American historian. Joe, you've made the best case for Adams on the 4th of March, 1801, getting on that dawn stage. Jefferson thought that it was personally ungentlemanly. Was any part of Adams just saying, the heck with it, I'm not coming to this guy's inauguration?
Yes, I think so. I don't want to apologize for him in a way that's dishonest. I think He wanted to get out of town. He was, and that was a rigged election. It was. Aaron Burr purchased the New York legislature that voted the electors for that election, and that's what made the difference. It was a sectional election. New England and most of the middle colonies went for Adams, and the South and the upper middle colonies the states went for Jefferson. It was close, and New York was the decisive vote. But nobody called about a recount then. Nothing. The media wasn't as involved as it is in our elections these days. Nobody thought about reversing the outcome.
But he does leave town and goes to New York, where he arrives too late, and then he retires to Quincy. He never really left.
Right. He stays there for the next 40 years. I mean, until he dies in 1826 on the same day as Mr. Jefferson.
So, question about this. In spite of that, which was clearly an indication of bitterness, I think more because he had been retired after a single term than that he had been replaced by Jefferson. But he then did write a letter a few days later to Jefferson saying something like, you'll know it better than I, but it's something like, I disagree with almost everything you stand for, and you haven't been exactly a man of integrity here, but I promise you that nobody will support your administration as much as I will do, etc. He wrote a generous letter to Jefferson saying, I get it, you're now the president, and I'm not going to be a kind of a grumbly former president. That's
right. And prior to that, when the election went into the House, remember, he's tied in the election with Burr because of the way they voted then. It's hard to explain to listeners now, but you voted for two people, and the one that got the most votes was the president. The one you voted to get the second most was the vice president. There was a tie between Jefferson and Burr that threw it into the House. It took 6 weeks. And during that time, Abigail and John had Jefferson over for dinner. And to introduce him to the members of the House that were actually going to be voting on his presidency. And Abigail knew him better than Jefferson did, and she kept trying to lobby for Jefferson at that time. And Jefferson didn't even know what she was doing. I mean, she was trying to help him because, well, the real reason is if they had to choose between Jefferson and Burr, there was no question from their point of view. But there was cooperation between the two great men and Abigail, who was the saucy self that we all fondly remember.
Now, in the interim, you called it an interregnum. An interregnum is a period between the rulership of two different people where there's some uncertainty about the continuity of constitutions. During that interim, John Adams made a number of appointments to the judiciary, including one William Marbury. Jefferson came to think of these as, quote, the midnight appointments, and he deeply resented that after he had been discredited by the American voters, Adams packed the courts with known enemies to Jefferson's system, including Chief Justice John Marshall, who then went on to preside over the Supreme Court for 34 years. My point is not to relitigate that. Abigail Adams did that beautifully in 1804 when she said to Jefferson, look, he's the president until the day he leaves the office. Get it? That's what a president does. She was right and Jefferson was wrong.
Although it relates to here's a case where what the Republicans did in the recent Senate to push through the
Amy Coney Barrett.
That's a version of what Adams did with the greatest Supreme Court justice in American history, John Marshall. It wasn't midnight. It wasn't done at, the midnight judges thing. And the role of the Supreme Court as the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution wasn't as clear then at all. So it wasn't as important.
We're recording this, a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with our eminent friend and our returning champion, Dr. Joseph Ellis, who is in Vermont in retirement and still writing extraordinary books. We're talking about this on the 6th day of November, so 3 days after the election. It's not quite clear yet what will happen, but it appears virtually certain now that Joe Biden will be the 46th president of the United States. That gives the Trump administration 11 weeks. What sort of things do you expect Trump to do as an administrator, as president, during those 11 weeks? Not whatever he says to the public or on Fox or in interviews or in his news conferences, but what sorts of acts can he do to make life harder for his successor or make life easier for himself once he leaves office?
My speculation is no better than anybody else's, I'm afraid, but I think that He's not going to make things easier. He's going to make things harder. Biden's team expects that.
In the midst of all this, I think it's very important that we acknowledge and remember that over 70 million Americans voted for Trump, and many of them did not because of his methods or his personality, but simply that they like his policies. And I think it's important to remember that politics is one of the few professions where being an amateur can be an asset.
Yeah.
I can't think of another one. So my optimistic point of view is that I'm really glad we're going to have a pro in there. You both talked about the difficulties he's going to have facing what he hopes is his agenda. But Biden's got experience at this.
He has.
And, I think if he's smart, he'll...
And the way he's handled the last few days is emblematic of that calm. And, and he hasn't announced his victory or anything like that. I mean, he is a decent and experienced guy, and they're handling this as well as anybody could possibly handle it right now, I think. But if I'm looking for a quotation, it's going to come from the last line in Tocqueville's Democracy in America. I'm full of apprehension and hope.
That's good.
Mine comes from the first inaugural address of none other than the third president of the United States.
Oh, God.
Listen to this, Joe. Let us, my fellow citizens, restore that harmony without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things.
We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans.
Dr. Ellis, all presidents, as they leave, do a raft of pardons. It's not at all uncommon. Some of them are highly controversial. Certainly, President Trump could pardon a number of people around him, his family, insiders, aides, people that are already convicted or about to be sentenced. Can he, as a president of the United States, pardon himself?
I didn't think that was true. Somebody asked me that question a year ago, and I said, no, of course not. And then I looked it up. It doesn't say he can, but it doesn't say he can't. And it's the one provision in the Constitution that's befuddling to me, because so much of the discussion about executive power throughout the summer of 1787 was haunted by the ghost of monarchy. And the one thing they really wanted to avoid was a monarch. And what kind of executive leader should a republic have? And yet here it is, one element that's very much a vestige of divine right, that the outgoing president has the power, the authority to pardon himself or anybody he wants to. And up till now, of course, that power has not been abused in any truly serious way. There have been questions about, say, some of Clinton's pardons, etc. But President Trump has the leeway to do almost anything he wants to. Again, though, the pardons can only be for federal offenses.
This is the 6th day of November, just 3 days after the election itself. There has been a considerable amount of protest from both sides. The right saying, stop stealing the election, stop the count, stop the steal, etc. And from the left, counter demonstrations and protests to make sure that the process is seen through to its end. So far, not too much violence. How much violence do you predict between the 6th day of November and the 21st of January?
I see some violence local. I do not see anything national. I don't see a civil war. I see pockets of demonstrations. I think that at the national level, I suspect that the Joint Chiefs have told the people that carry the nuclear codes that they should do nothing without consulting the Joint Chiefs themselves to make sure that nothing catastrophic at that level could occur. And I'm not speculating that Trump would do that. But I do think that in certain communities, and you guys live in one, you're liable to see protests in the streets of people who really feel that this has been a stolen election. And I just hope it stays as nonviolent as it possibly can be.
Did you ever think that in your lifetime you would have to utter these sentences, that you are counting on the Joint Chiefs or the deep state or the establishment to ensure the peaceful transfer of power?
No, but I mean, there are movies made about this. Of course, that's all fiction. But people have imagined this scenario before. Um, there was during the Nixon years. Apparently, Secretary of Defense Schlesinger did exactly what I said, because Nixon was drinking heavily as the impeachment was looming over his head, and they did have concern about him. So there's a precedent for this. Um, President Trump is not an alcoholic. He's not drinking at all. And I'm not speculating he's going to do something catastrophic. I think what we're liable to see is sporadic acts of local protest, some of which become violent. I hope very low level. I think a lot depends on whether or not a certain number of Republicans, traditional Republicans, step forward to say that the election's over and to put an end to this. And it's not clear at this stage whether and when that will happen.
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break. When we return, I have a question for the both of you about precedents set by presidents, if that would be all right.
Of course.
Sure. That's what historians are supposed to know about.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this very special post-election edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're recording this on the 6th day of November, so 3 days after the election. And as things stand now, it appears that Joe Biden becomes the 46th president of the United States. He appears to have won the vote in Pennsylvania, probably Georgia, almost certainly Nevada, and perhaps Arizona, which puts him over the 270 vote Electoral College majority. He may win by a 306 majority in the Electoral College. That's where things stand, but stay tuned, everyone. I want to say one thing before turning it back to you, David Swenson. I've been listening to us talking here, and I've been trying to put myself in the mind of a Trump supporter, someone listening to this who doesn't like the Democrats, doesn't like Biden, doesn't like that level of government or that level of taxation or that level of regulation or whatever it is, somebody who is a strong supporter of President Trump, who is, of course, disappointed and maybe even appalled by what has just happened. But I can't, and you tell me if I'm wrong, David Swenson, I can't think of anything that's been said in the last 40 minutes here that is partisan. In other words, I think what Professor Ellis is telling us is that there are constitutional norms, that elections involve people either sending in their ballot or appearing in person, that those ballots must be counted. When they're counted, there are winners and there are losers. In this case, it appears that there is no voter fraud to speak of, maybe none at all, and that Joe Biden is the winner of the election. And so I can imagine why a conspiracy theorist might say it's all rigged and you're full of it and you two are just, you don't have any idea what you're talking about. But I don't think that any responsible Republican could say that anything that Joe has said here is partisan. We each have our politics, of course, but I think Joe is talking about the sanctity of the rule of law and the Constitution of the United States and peaceful transfer of power. Is that what you're hearing, David?
Well, I think oftentimes when it comes to politics, people hear what they want to hear, but you sort of lead me into my next question when you talk about norms. I would say that last week we had a show on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, which was your idea, Clay, and it was a great idea. You set up a Zoom town hall. I think it was limited to 100 participants, and we had people waiting all the time. But we had people from all over the country, literally, and all over the world. We had a caller from Great Britain and Chile and Mexico. And I was really struck by the civility. And this wasn't necessarily all Democratic viewpoints. I mean, we had some very strong Trump supporters on there, and it was an incredibly civil conversation. And I know that it helped a lot of people understand the other side. It made me very proud because that's what the Jefferson Hour is supposed to do, in my estimation. But I wanted to ask the two of you, it's too great of an opportunity to miss. One of the great concerns for many Democratic leaning people is the change in the presidency. In other words, the precedents that have been set in the past have been dramatically changed during this presidency. There are those who would say that Obama really overstepped the norms in his use of executive power, but Trump has kind of taken it to a new level. So is that a legitimate concern, or is that sort of an empty threat?
I don't think it's empty. I think that Obama was forced to use executive orders because the Republican Senate and McConnell said that its highest priority was to block everything he was going to do, and that things like joining the Paris Accords and the Iran Treaty had to be done that way. Trump and his attorney general actually believe that the president, while president, is above the law. He is a law unto himself. That, to me, is a repudiation of the basic values on which the republic was founded.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that a more moderate president will return to the norms, or will he continue on?
He will return to the norms.
What about you, Clay? What do you think?
I hate to disagree with my friend, the eminent Joe Ellis. I do disagree a little bit. So I was very much concerned with President Obama's executive orders. All presidents use them. Don't get us wrong. It began with George Washington. Jefferson had executive orders. But I think that the vacuum that President Obama tried to fill when the House and Senate wouldn't cooperate with him is a dangerous gesture. And now all modern presidents do it. Increasingly we have moved towards a semi-monarchical system, but that's not what the Constitution calls for. And I think, for example, the Paris Accord, the Iran deal, and the DACA business are pretty significant things, and they must go through the actual process. And so if the House and Senate refuse to engage in these things, it seems to me that the president needs to throw himself on the will of the people and say, in the next election, you've got to put in a different kind of government that can actually address these sorts of questions. But I'm highly uncomfortable with executive orders, especially the ones that involve very significant issues and the spending of money. I think the country has been moving into this constitutional crisis with a capital C for a long time, and certainly President Trump is not the only one, but he's the most egregious user of executive authority. Does that seem wrong to you, Joe?
No, I don't think so. I'd add a variable to it, though, that if you look at the pattern over time, historically, in a broad way, and you read the Constitution and you try to figure in Article 2 what powers the presidency has, good luck, because it's extremely ambiguous. And like the great crisis of Jefferson's term was the fate of the middle west of the United States. And should he use an executive order to purchase Louisiana? And it was an executive order. He knew he was violating the Constitution as he saw it. And he did it anyway. And he said, I have to do it because we can't afford to allow France to occupy that portion of the continent. I think that Lincoln went beyond the powers of his office in order to mobilize support for the Union in 1861-62. I think that Franklin Roosevelt went beyond power in order to mobilize support against the Depression in 1933-34. So that the power of the executive is allowed to expand when there's a crisis that everybody acknowledges is a true crisis. And I think you can make a case that the pandemic we're facing constitutes another crisis. I don't think it would be wise for President Biden, or President-elect Biden, to go that far. And I think he will make it voluntary and let the states have a major say in this. Whenever you become a world power and foreign policy becomes the primary focus of the president, the power of the executive branch increases. The size of the executive branch increases. And that has certainly happened. But now I think that Attorney General Barr and a few originalists in the Federalist Society seem to believe that the presidency stands above the law altogether. And when you take that step, you step into the abyss.
You mentioned two crises in the Jefferson administration, but I think those 70 million people who just voted for Mr. Trump would say that the crisis now is not the pandemic, it's the threat of the Democrats and the liberals and the professoriate to the American way of life, all three of those words written in all caps, American way of life. That's four. I think that they believe that this is that crisis and he is that leader, and that's what justifies his taking extra constitutional actions. Do you think that's unfair?
I want you to break it down. What do you mean?
We're in danger of having porous borders, the loss of a kind of a common sense nation, or Lee Greenwood's nation where liberty matters more than government solutions. I mean, those are not all of those are contemptible things. I think that people honestly feel that something that they thought was America, sort of Lee Greenwood's America, at least I know I'm free. I think they feel that that is being eroded in every direction around them, and that their support for Trump is reactive to what they take to be too breathtaking, too sudden, too progressive change in too short an amount of time.
I suspect you're, to some extent, accurately reporting their mentality. In that sense, yes, there are multiple dimensions of this. I mean, it had to do with guns, has to do with abortion, has to do with economic inequality, but that the dominant one to me is race. One of the consequences of this election is to show in Georgia and even in Texas, which went Trump, but it very barely, that we are becoming a multiracial society. Demographically, that is built in, baked in. And I think if the agenda is to turn back the clock on the civil rights movement, that you're going to lose in the long run. The Republican Party's Southern strategy since Nixon's years is not going to work for much longer. So there's no question where the future lies here. It also seems to me that technology is replacing manufacturing jobs throughout the nation, and that the globalization is here to stay, that isolation from that world is effectively impossible economically. And so if they are holding on to something, I'm not sure what it is. There is no question. This is where America's going, and it's not going to stop.
Gentlemen, we don't have a lot of time left for this week's conversation. I've got a screen on, and I'm watching vote totals come in, and it's pretty apparent that Biden is going to win this election. If he doesn't, it's going to put sort of an interesting twist on this whole conversation. But I'd like to end on something perhaps optimistic and hear from the both of you, and that is Biden's chances when he gets into office. What do you think he'll be able to do to unite the American public and put us on our best foot forward?
Well, I think that's what he will attempt to do, and he's made that fairly clear. They're not going to be red states or blue states. There's going to be red, white, and blue states. He's offering that he's going to be the president of all the American people. That's been his campaign motto, and I'm sure that's what he's going to try to do. I would like to believe that the pandemic represents the immediate threat that he needs to take action on, and that we'll get cooperation. But I'm not so sure that's going to happen. I believe that the Senate Majority Leader has already said that he intends to block everything that Biden proposes. If the Republicans hold the Senate, which looks highly likely, it's no longer certain because of the situation in Georgia, 2 runoffs. I think domestic legislation by the Obama administration will be blocked. And the initiatives that he looked to bring forward, say a higher minimum wage, his public option in health care will probably not be able to be passed. On foreign policy, I think he'll have a much broader mandate, and we will rejoin we will support the EU, we will support NATO, we will rejoin the Paris Accord, and initiatives in that direction will have greater success. But I, based on what we've seen thus far, I'd like to be more positive. But I think that the Republicans actually gain seats in the House, and they gain seats in the state legislature, And those state legislatures will now control the census of 2020 and are going to gerrymander things to make it more unrepresentative as a result. So there are long-term trends that work against the Biden agenda.
Clay, you get the last word.
I agree with what Dr. Ellis has been saying. A couple of things. I think the most important thing is to bring down the temperature, to bring back normalcy, to bring back calm, not to have crazy pronouncements and tweets, not to have the controversy of the day. I think we need to return to what John McCain called regular order, and I fully expect Joe Biden to be that sort of a president, to bring a level of calm and regularity and American decorum and deportment to his presidency. So that's good news immediately. I would ask him to spend his first week calling all of our foreign friends and adversaries and assuring them that America is a reliable partner in NATO, a reliable partner with the EU, and letting our adversaries know that we are going to be tough and we are going to expect them to comport themselves within the international rule of law. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that he needs to be clear, consistent, and responsible on the pandemic. This crisis is going to grow much, much more severe in the next 4 or 5 months. I think we need consistency. We need science to be at the center. We need to defer, again, to experts. And I would urge President Biden to rejoin the World Health Organization immediately and to take the boot off the CDC and other health organizations in this country so they can tell the truth as they see it, so that we know the messaging is reliable and has scientifically based credibility. And then finally, I would urge President Biden to get us back into the Paris Climate Accords if he can, to get us back into the Iran treaty if he can. And I would urge him within the first 90 days to send the most comprehensive package he can to the House and the Senate about the Dreamers, about the DACA program, and see if we can't get some kind of a national consensus on allowing these young people to stay. You know, a 2-year-old brought into this country by her or his parents from Mexico or Guatemala didn't come voluntarily. They've known no other country in their lives. They're Americans as deeply as you and I are Americans. You know, we must do something to regularize their lives and give them security. And so these things, I think, are doable. The last one will be the hardest, but I think they can be done, and I expect that the calm alone will be the greatest gift that Joe Biden can give to the United States. What do you think, Joe?
I like it. I agree with what you're saying there. I would add that maybe one of the Jefferson hour, especially as we think, I do think they're going to be able to reach agreement on the need for an immediate infusion of money into the economy, and they'll reach a compromise. There, McConnell will go along with Biden, and they'll reach a compromise, override Pelosi and anybody else who wants to make it one way or the other. I think that the concept that the Jefferson hour has to offer here is something that Jefferson called self-government, and the belief, and it's a belief that's optimistic, but to offer it, that we need to come together as a people on this coronavirus, and masks will become not a measure of, people will wear masks because they care about their fellow Americans as well as about themselves. But it's got to be voluntary. It's got to come from within. It cannot come from government above. And the call on Americans for that, that's a plea. It's a Jeffersonian plea, but it really would be, I think it will resonate for some people.
A Jeffersonian plea coming from the greatest Adams scholar in this country. I feel vindicated. It's spiritual. It's in the hearts of the people. Joe, this has been spectacular. This is a historical document. We're talking to one of the most eminent historians in America, who is an expert in the early national period, who knows what there is to know about the founding generation. And we have today preliminarily provided, I hope, some context and historical insight into the election that just has occurred. It's the 6th of November. Stay tuned. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
So at this point, you podcast listeners to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, you would normally hear the credits begin and turn off the broadcast, because who listens to all those credits? But this week, we got Joseph Ellis to stick around and extend the conversation. So rather than the credits we're going to play that.
Yeah, it's important. We had this conversation on the Jefferson Hour today about how things look on November 6th here, just 3 days after the election of November 3rd, 2020. And I wanted Professor Ellis to make his commentary before we know exactly how this plays out, because historians tend to look back, and of course he's as good at this as anyone in America, but it's sometimes fun to have them project carefully forward. And so he makes a number of really interesting statements about what we can expect in the next 11 weeks and how the election will work itself out, and what a Biden administration, if that's what it turns out to be, will look like for America. And he even makes recommendations of how President Biden should move forward. And he says several times, with his usual humility, we could turn out to be full of beans here, but it's an interesting exercise. And I also want to say that I love this program because, as you probably can hear, David, I'm very anxious about the appearance that there's sort of liberal bias here. And I think that what Joe said today is absolutely spot on. In other words, he's not talking about whether Biden's has better policies, or Biden is a nicer man. He's saying that the kind of shenanigans that current President Trump is engaged in, of undermining the legitimacy of the election, of saying that it's rigged, of lashing out, of suggesting that he might not leave office peacefully, that those are fundamentally irresponsible things for any president, whether it's Andrew Jackson or John Kennedy on the one hand, or Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump on the other, ever to do. That we're in a unique situation here. I just hope everyone realizes that in no way was the discourse on today's program sort of a liberally biased discourse. It was an eminent American historian saying this has never happened before.
So again, we had to close our conversation due to specific time constraints of the broadcast version of the Jefferson Hour, but the conversation continued after that, and we've made the decision to put that ending bit of the conversation unedited onto this podcast, and we hope you enjoy it.
We're on a historical inflection point here. We're living through one of the most momentous moments in the history of the United States. It's not even clear yet how it's going to come out, and so I think that is the reason why we wanted to keep the tape recorder rolling, David, and listen to as many insights from Professor Joseph Ellis as we possibly could.
So let's join that conversation now.
I think this has been a very good conversation. I think that we got it right. I think that Joe Biden will win, and win not, I won't say definitively, but comfortably, with probably 306 votes in the Electoral College. And that gives me great hope, because I was worried that if it was a narrow victory of 270, that a cloud of illegitimacy would hang over his presidency. There will still be an attempt to create a cloud of illegitimacy, but it'll be much harder to accomplish if Georgia votes for Biden and if Pennsylvania votes for Biden. So that gives me joy, and I think that we got it right today. But Joe, how concerned are you, in kind of a deep emotional level, not an intellectual level, but an emotional level, about the trough we find ourselves in, where a sitting president is saying nothing but lies now, and saying that the election was rigged, and that the votes are spurious, and that there is wholesale corruption to steal an American election from him? How emotionally, how does that place you?
Right now, very, very worried. I agree with you. The legal challenges here are not going to amount to anything. As I said at the start, it's an electorally decisive verdict, but it's a snapshot of a divided nation. The ardency and the conspiratorial mentality within the Trump constituency is extremely powerful. Even when Trump goes, it's still there. And the kind of decisive blow that moved us forward has not occurred. The Republicans who have committed themselves to Trump and essentially abandoned many of the traditional values of the Republican Party in the process have not been told that was a mistake. They still see the base of the Republican Party as a Trump party. Therefore, I'm concerned that, I can draw up scenarios here that are all highly, speculative. I think we'll get through the immediate 6 or 8 weeks, but we're trying to do something that no major nation in history has ever done. We're trying to put together, and this is something that Jefferson saw. If you remember in his autobiography, Clay, and I'll quote his words here, "Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free," he's talking about African Americans, "nor is it less certain that the new race is equally free, cannot live in the same government. Nature, habit, opinion has drawn indelible lines of distinction between them." The idea that we can become a biracial and now multiracial society is a very recent idea. It's a mid-20th century idea. Everybody, even the abolitionists, thought that we were going to take these African Americans back to Africa or to the Caribbean. It's clear that these people are part of our society, and that there are other factors moving here too as well, economic especially, and global and technology, to be sure. But that's the deepest issue.
So you see that race is the fundamental divide in American culture even now.
What again means to most people what Make America Great Again is, before we had a guy that looked like Barack Obama as my leader. People in that camp are many people that are like you and I know them, and they're the kind of neighbors that would come to your house and save your butt if you were in trouble, and can take care of your kids when you have to leave town. But they cannot imagine a society in which blacks and Hispanics are truly equal citizens.
I wonder about that. I hear you and I want to resist, and I know you say it with great hesitation
and reluctance, but I think that what we have to face is the assumption that this is sort of like just a given that this is going to happen. This is really a hard thing to do. And I mean, China couldn't do it, Japan couldn't do it, Germany couldn't do it, England can't do it. That this is really hard to do, and it's vulnerable to demagogues.
I think Canada is doing quite well at this. Britain is doing better than we are at this, but we have this problem. Jefferson said in that famous statement in the autobiography, yes, we are going to free the slaves. Of course, that may not happen soon, but it will happen. It's inevitable that they will be emancipated. But he said, and I'm paraphrasing now, but he said essentially, Joe, I'm uncomfortable with the idea that there can ever be a harmonious biracial republic. It just probably can't happen. And so we're testing that. And I think my conservative Trump friends, I think, would say this if they were on this call. They would say, look, it's not that we're racists. It's that we think that the country's making much too much of a deal about this, about the police brutality and about systemic racism and so on, that we feel that we've largely solved this problem, and that African Americans are kind of laying it on thick about this, and we don't want to talk about reparations, and we don't want to talk about systemic racism. Maybe those things exist, but we need to emphasize the positive that's happened since Brown v. Board of Education, and maybe this has just been taken a little bit too far. Now, you and I don't agree with that, Joe, but I think that is that's an acceptable, it's certainly a true reading of lots and lots and lots of Republicans and conservatives.
But then when you get somebody in the office of the presidency who wants to divide us on that issue,
of course,
and who wants to play the race card up or down,
yes, I'm with you on that.
You see a reaction. You see people genuinely fearful that the Mexicans coming up from Venezuela or from Guadalupe, wherever, are going to come and take their house away from them. That people are going to come and take their guns away from them, or that the federal government, the socialism, is going to impose itself. The irony is that instead of socialism, they seem to be in favor of dictatorship. That there's an educational problem at the root of this, whereas race is the real root, the real cancer. The fact that over half of the American electorate, more than half, couldn't pass the civics test required of incoming immigrants makes them vulnerable to misinformation and to conspiracy theories in a way that they shouldn't be, in a way Jefferson believes they wouldn't be, because he envisioned a more educated society.
That's one of the concerns that I have, Joe. When you see the sort of exit polls and we begin to analyze the election of 2020, what I'm hearing is that there is a very significant education gap. That the higher people's educational level, the more they have graduated from college or done any secondary,
And the colleges are
post-secondary education.
responsible partly for this, in part because they price themselves out of the middle class. These working class people can't imagine how they're going to send their kids to a college. And higher education, of which I was a part, was largely very much a part of this. And then within it, the disciplines in history, for example, are preaching a politically correct view of American history that's really crazy. So yeah. I'm going to throw into the variable. If you're trying to do something on it in a Biden administration that responds to this in a collectivistic, new nationalistic, I go here with Theodore Roosevelt rather than Jefferson. I would put Buttigieg in head of a new major program for public service that's designed to. Remember how Washington used to think that he wanted to have this university in the new capital,
A national university.
yeah, and the reason he wanted that is he wanted people to come together from all parts of the United States and interact, and there would be this elite that got to know each other, sort of like a American version of the Rhodes Scholar program almost. And that I think, and then my father's generation, was forced into interacting with people during World War II. That you can't do this on the same national scale, but something that gets us going in a way that there's 2 years of not mandatory but voluntary national service that provides people with, let's say, money for community colleges and involves them in environmental projects, but not a military thing so much as a environmental and domestic policy. The New Deal CCC is an example, but that the goal of it is to bring people together who otherwise are existing in tribal cliques. It would be small, but I think it's an important gesture that would be really helpful.
I want to bring David Swenson back in here, but first I want to say a couple quick things. I urge everyone to read the book Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. It's by Brian Stelter, who is a CNN commentator. Yeah, I've been listening to it. It's a brilliant book, and it shows the sort of the closed loop between Trump and Fox and the alt-right, and all of them feeding each other. And it's a really excellent analysis. Stelter interviewed more than 200 people from within the Fox network itself who are concerned about the ways in which untruths have become orthodoxy in a kind of a daily free exchange between Donald Trump and his minions and the major figures like Tucker Carlson on the Fox network, Laura Ingraham, and Sean Hannity. So I really urge people to take a look at this. I don't think that it's a partisan book. Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth by Brian Stelter. The other thing I want to say is going back to what you just said, Joe, about education. The great elite colleges like Brown and Columbia and Stanford and so on have priced themselves out of the range of most Americans. So I'm not necessarily for free higher education for all, but I think we must address the problem of student debt and the staggering and obscene costs of higher education, because unless we extend the benefits of education in something like a GI Bill of Rights to every American who wants to get a higher education, that should be doable in a society as rich and as privileged as ours. And if we don't do that, we're going to continue this gulf, because the best educated Americans turn out to be the blue Americans, and the less well-educated Americans turn out to be the red Americans. It's a triumph for Jefferson in a certain ugly way. It means the higher your educational level, the more enlightened you are, and the less prone you are to conspiracy theories. But that can't be the answer. We can't allow ourselves to have two Americas.
I agree, but I've spent 40 years in conversations among those kind of institutions at Yale and Mount Holyoke and Amherst and Williams, and they're just as closed-minded about it as some of the people that you're describing on the alt-right.
Of course, closed-minded from the left.
They can't imagine that they're going to have to open it up to people, and I mean how it doesn't, their financial their financial portfolio doesn't allow for that. Although, I mean, Harvard could pay for everybody if they wanted to with their endowment. But yeah, I mean, there are closed-minded people on the left too.
Certainly.
But yes, and I think that I might be wrong about this. I've just written a piece for the LA Times called "Let's Do It," that she's going to do next week, I think. It is let's make a play to really do away with the Electoral College. The presidency is the one office in the land, the elected office, that represents all the American people. It doesn't represent states, and okay, that's impossible to achieve. Do it anyway. Community service, some sort of effort, impossible to achieve. Get it going. Paying for higher education, impossible to achieve. Let's put it on the agenda, because all those things represent an attempt to create a public definition of America, a national definition of America, and that's obviously the direction we got to head.
That's brilliant. David?
Well, first off, I want to say thanks again to Joe. You are so generous with your time, and all of us
Hey,
appreciate
we're all up here
that.
quarantined. We got to talk to somebody, for guys.
And I know that you have places to go and people to see today, and I'm feeling guilty about taking advantage of your time. So maybe I can head this towards a close. But I asked the two of you at the end of the regular broadcast, about what your level of optimism was for Biden. And, it's kind of my position sometimes to make sure that we keep somewhat of a balance to the conversation. Last week we did a very interesting show. It was an edited version of a 2-hour Zoom, what Clay called town hall. And in the midst of that, we had 3 calls from Trump supporters. And every one of them was very intelligent, very straightforward. I don't think any of them really defended Trump's bombastic behavior. And in fact, one of them said he was the worst presidential communicator during his lifetime. But they like his policies. They think that economically he's done them a lot of good. So we have the left, which is stressing empathy and care for one another, and we have the right, which is stressing the economic benefits of Trump in his presidency. But I have to remain optimistic about all of this. My optimism is going to hold for Biden should the vote continue on in his way and he become the president. As I said, he's a pro. And I predict, I loved your idea of Buttigieg for a national service thing. I think we're going to see stuff like that. And I also predict that he's going to go right at infrastructure because it's something that...
I agree with that. We didn't mention that.
Yeah, both parties want that.
That could be an issue that we get a consensus on, too.
Yeah,
because that's a jobs thing.
And
when we sold the interstate highway system under Eisenhower, it was sold as a national defense measure to be able to move tanks from one coast to the other if invaded by Russia or something. We can sell this one as an economic injection that is desperately needed by the right now in the wake of the pandemic.
And I also liked his 180-day review of the Supreme Court, and I think we're probably going to see more of that. Perhaps in the issues of race that, and I don't think it's entirely him ducking, answering. I think he's one of those guys who goes, well, there's a lot of people that are maybe smarter than me and better informed, and I ought to listen to them. And I applaud that.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to you, Joe Ellis. We'll keep talking with you. The pandemic's not going to end anytime soon, so you will be in lockdown up there in your redoubt.
I'm up here in Vermont, which right now is the safest state in the union. The snows have already come, but they've melted. But I see clear sky right now.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to this week's special podcast edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.